Hello, folks. If you were expecting the soothed dulcets of Tim's voice, you don't get it again this week. He is back with the living amongst us, and we're hoping to have him back on the podcast here soon. But Daneelius and I wanted to get together and have a bonus episode of the Jank Tank and mostly talk about a possible problem in cubing at the moment, and that is the Pixie problem, or as I changed the title at the last minute, the Skyfisher Society and its consequences. So I've got our peasant specialist, or special guest, as it were, Daneelius. How are you doing today, Daneelius?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back, and glad that Tim's back as well. Excited to get to talk to him soon.
Yeah, we're very glad to have him back. Hoping to record our next episode will either be a dev diary where we do like a mini rework of the white section in our cube, or it'll be the Spider-Man update. We're not 100% sure yet. Okay, so on these bonus episodes, we usually try to get directly to the content. So I'm just going to do a quick, remember that the best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank podcast is to join our Discord server, draft with us, and give us your feedback. It's a great place to hang out with like-minded individuals and talk about Cube, Retail Limited, and all things Magic. You can find links to our Discord server wherever you're listening to this podcast. And you can also find Daneelius on the Limited Level Ups Discord. And if you haven't seen Limited Level Ups before, it's my personal favorite retail limited content on YouTube. So big shout out to Alex and them over there. Anyways, Jank Diver Gaming, we host tons of scheduled drafts throughout the week, including our Peasant Cube on Saturday nights. Saturday evenings, I believe now. We moved that time slot back. The mainline Jank Diver Cube is on Sunday nights, and we have F&M style drafts on Friday nights where our players get to vote on the cube they play, as well as various guest cubes created by members of our server throughout the week. And so there's plenty to do. Remember, you can find us at Twitter at Jank Diver Gaming, YouTube and youtube.com/JankDiverGaming, and me at twitch.tv/Teld Talks. Daneelius, do you have any shout outs before we get started?
Nope, let's do it.
Okay, cool. So for a single card discussion today, we're going to be talking a lot about pixies and Skyfishers. And so we figured we would start talking about the white game object sort of space, which is really where these cards are kind of becoming known for. I consider them just a piece of this broader puzzle. And so the card we're going to talk about today is Carrot Cake, which is a card from Bloomborough. It's a common, and it's a very unassuming common. It is 1 and a white for an artifact food, and when it enters, and when you sacrifice it, you create a 1/1 white rabbit creature token and scry 1, and you can, as any food, pay 2, tap it, sack it, and gain 3 life. And we mostly wanted to talk about this card because, again, it's the kind of card that doesn't read particularly powerfully. And even when you play it, it takes a little while to kind of see how much value you accumulate. But the combination of multiple game objects, being an artifact, getting value when you sack it, and the scry ones all really add up to make this a great glue card for the white mid-range decks into other spaces.
Yeah, and I think it really does a good job of kind of showing where Magic has come at the peasant level over the past few years, because maybe 7, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, this card would have been something like Raise the Alarm or a Raise the Alarm style card. And if you think about what Raise the Alarm's giving you, it's you're spending 2 mana and you're getting 2 bodies, and you get a spell in your yard, you get a spell trigger, I suppose. This has so much more potential upside than that because it is this game object. It's a game object that sits in play, that generates you this value. It's a game object that goes to your graveyard and can be recurred, and generally speaking, it's pretty easy these days to recur these permanents from the yard, easier probably than recurring spells from the yard. So there's just so much that you can do with this object that you can't do with just a simple spell like Raise the Alarm. Like you said, it plays super well in artifact spaces with cards like Sekenzen Smelter. And part of the thing that makes this such a great glue card is you don't really need to pair this with stuff like the Skyfishers that we're going to be talking about later. It kind of does it all itself, and it does so a little bit inefficiently, and that's often the rule for a lot of these game objects that we're going to be talking about. They might be slightly less efficient than another version of the card that isn't so game object centered, but with all the objects and with the permanence of this, there's just so much more you can do with it.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed playing this card. It's grown on me a lot. I've played it in a variety of cubes now, and yeah, you just feel like you always find something to do, and the fact that it's an artifact just ends up mattering. And I find it a really cool glue card across basically the entire spectrum in the Jank Diver cube, because, you know, even in green, you're taking advantage sometimes of the tokens that this is making. So yeah, really sweet glue card, and kind of segues us into the main topic of today, which is going to be basically about Skyfishers, game objects, the rise of this like white game objects, black, white, Esper, you know, not necessarily locked into those colors. I consider these decks all base white. So if you are unfamiliar, when we say a Skyfisher, these are all variations of the card Core Skyfisher, which came about what feels like a million years ago in Zendikar with the printing of the card Core Skyfisher, which is 1 and a white for a 2/3 flyer, and when it enters, you are forced to return a permanent you control to its owner's hand. So when they printed this card, it was a very overstated 2-drop, and it had an actual downside. You know, people started looking for ways to kind of offset this downside, but it looked very strange. It was like picking up Memnites to trigger Quest for the Holy Relic, which is an old enchantment that allowed you to play a bunch. If you played a bunch of creatures, you could like sack it and go get an equipment out of your deck and put it into play. And so these used to not really be a limited thing. This was like a one-off effect that, you know, there had been a couple of versions here and there. And really it was in Pauper where we saw the first versions of these decks that were kind of doing the value thing. They were playing Ichor Wellspring with the combination of like Core Skyfisher and Glithawk to pick up these little draw cards and turn your Core Skyfishers into value engines. And if you've played any limited in the last few years, you would know that these cards are now really something we see in every set. And mostly came about, I think, as we'll talk about, when WotC started moving from spells as creatures to spells as non-creature game objects. That seemed to be the turning point where we really started seeing Skyfishers become in vogue in retail.
You know, I think one thing you said there is important, where kind of the early idea of a Skyfisher was you're getting a really good body for the mana spent, and there's this downside of having to pick something up, and you try to turn that into not as big of a downside by picking up something maybe with an ETB. But for, at least at the time, the majority of objects with ETBs, with end of the battlefield effects, were creatures. And so you would, at least in a limited context, you'd try to pair a Skyfisher with a cheap creature that had an ETB. You know, you can think of, you know, cards like 2-mana 1/1 draw a card, or et cetera. And so you're not getting that much of a downside. Maybe even in some cases you're getting an upside, but you're just trying to mitigate the downside of the fact that you have to pick something up. And then over time they started shifting this effect to instant speed, or maybe even it was towards the beginning that they shifted it to instant speed. But an instant speed Skyfisher is interesting because you can use it to save one of your creatures from removal. And so there's this added benefit, but you're still trying to figure out how to make value from this effect where, you know, on its face, it definitely does seem like a downside, at least at the beginning it did.
Yeah, and if you haven't been playing Magic all the way back in Zendikar, it really can't be overstated how bad creatures used to be. You know, we think of now, you know, Virus Beetle being just the type of effect that we see in every set, and the sort of split skin doll. What is it? What's the name of the one from Neo that was the original
Spirited
2-mana
Companion.
version? Yeah, Spirited Companion. We see those effects quite often now. And that was really not the case. Like back in older Magic, creatures below 3 mana really didn't have ETBs super often. They usually were like 4 mana for, you know, make a 1/1 was the kind of deal you were getting. You know, and then that's like when I believe it was Cloud Concealer was printed. People freaked out because it was a 3 mana ETB creature that also flew. And so it was not easy to just get free value out of these cards. And in addition, a lot of the cards that you could do it with, like I mentioned, Ichor Wellspring, those were cards that only drew cards, right? They didn't add or subtract from the board. And so you were just getting like a +1 out of it, which was good. You know, getting a 2-mana 2/3 flyer that draws you a card is powerful. But it was not the kind of thing that was actively contributing to the board, which is not what we see now with these Skyfishers in Cube.
Yeah, so definitely these days we're getting more objects with different options associated with them. But I think that the key idea here is just that it was difficult to get value. And one key note here is that we're really talking mostly in a limited context. There are certainly some interesting auras from the early days of Magic, where if you picked them up, you made your opponent sack the permanent that it was attached to. There's definitely interesting combos that you could get up to with Skyfishers, but really in the limited context is what we're talking about mostly. And there, you're just talking about getting a tiny bit of extra value, and at the cost of having to redeploy the object that you returned to your hand. And the benefit of that was you got a pretty decently sized flyer, especially for those times.
Yeah, you mentioning that did remind me, because I used to be a pretty avid Pauper player back in the day, and reminded me of the Reality Acid deck. It was called Acid Trip, and that's what you would do, is you played a 3-mana aura called Reality Acid that had fading, and when it left the battlefield, the creature or the permanent that it was attached to died, and then you pick it up with... I think it was you used Core Skyfisher, and I think there's a aura bouncing blue creature, if I remember right, or were the two original ones.
And I think, honestly, a lot of people were trying that in early cubes as well. I recall from back in the day trying to see people make cool combos with Skyfishers. But the point is that you had to work hard for your value in those days. And that's changed quite a lot.
Yeah. Well, nowadays, especially every set, we feel, especially over the last year or two, it's felt like we've gotten cards that were just previously would have been an instant sorcery that are now getting turned into just enchantments or artifacts. For me, the real turning point was Nowhere to Run. I don't know when you remember for you, because I remember when MKM came out, we were really excited about a card called Soul Innervation, and we were a little worried that it was too expensive. It was 3 and a black, and I think it gave the creature -4/-4, and then it had the Grave Break effect of when a creature leaves the graveyard, you drained one. I believe was maybe it was a card leaves the graveyard, you drain one. In any case, it was like a 4-mana enchantment that did this removal spell thing, and we were really excited because that was such a unique effect. And we had LCI, we had Spring-Loaded Sawblade. But then when we got Nowhere to Run in Duskmourn, that was like a wow, they printed this an uncommon moment for me, because that was just, it is a 2-mana removal spell with just perfectly appropriately costed that also kills something on rate. It was a huge turning point for me in my evaluation of these cards.
Yeah, so I think it's important at this point to underline the fact that these pixie effects, these Skyfisher effects, in retail limited, at least for quite some time, haven't actually been super impressive cards. At least the average Skyfisher, I would say, haven't been super impressive cards in retail limited. I was looking back, I saw that Nurturing Pixie itself, which is kind of the quintessential Skyfisher these days, at least in constructed, Ambrosia Whiteheart, which just came out in the Final Fantasy set, Sun Pearl Kirin in TDM. These were all C-, C++ level cards in their environments. And some of the folks actually remember when Whiteheart got spoiled. Maybe it was when Kirin got spoiled. One of the drafters of my cube was doing card evaluation. He was like, "Oh, this is insane. This is like a B+, A- level card." And that's because he was coming from my cube, where these Skyfisher effects perform so incredibly well. And then it ended up not being all that impressive in retail. And I think the big reason for that is not all retail sets are jammed filled with these cards you're talking about, like Nowhere to Run, that are so clearly or so awesome to pick up. These cards that are mostly just spells, but they leave an object behind to then pick up with the Skyfisher. It doesn't always happen. Compare those cards I just mentioned with something like Fear of Isolation, which is basically just an enchantment version of Skyfisher. That card in Duskmourn was really, really good. It was one of the best performing Peasant cards in the set. But that was in a set with a ton of spells as game objects in all of the rooms. Nowhere to Run itself, and there's a few more. It was like an enchantment-based set, so there's a lot more cards just sitting in play for Fear of Isolation to pick up, and Fear of Isolation performed really, 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 really well. So I do think it really matters that these cards get paired with cards like Nowhere to Run that are really good to pick up. But in terms of when did I see this happening, I was really curious to kind of see the evolution of these objects as spells since the beginning of time. And the first I was able to find was Contagion Clasp, which was way back in, I want to say, Scars of Mirrodin. It's a 2-mana artifact that put a -1/-1 counter on an opposing creature. But then we went from there to Mortar Pod, which is a living weapon that you could sack the creature it was attached to deal damage. Exclusion Ritual, and Meteorite. And again, these are cards I'm focusing on objects that kill your opponent's creatures, because like you mentioned, objects that just draw cards, really, you want to do more than that with your Pixie effects, and we'll get into all that a little bit later, but just talking specifically about these objects that kill your opponent's creatures. Like I said, Exclusion Ritual, Meteorite, Fireforger's Puzzle Knot, and for me, actually, where things kind of turned was in the Amonkhet block with the Trial Cycle. And so these were enchantments that on ETB did something like a spell. So Trial of Ambition and Trial of Zeal are two that I pulled out. One dealt 3 damage to an opposing creature, and the other made your opponent sacrifice a creature. And then they had these kind of Skyfisher clauses built in, where when you played a cartouche, which was a type of aura in the set, you got to just pick up these trials and then replay them again. And from my viewing, these were the first times where they really pushed hard on this concept of like a spell effect just stapled to a permanent, and then even telling you, hey, do some work to pick this up. And then very quickly after the trials, we had Theros Beyond Death. And I think this is kind of where everything changed, because Theros Beyond Death is where we got sagas like Elspeth's Nightmare, that the whole point of a saga is that it's a permanent in play, but because it goes away, and it's a permanent in play, but because it goes away, it kind of needs to have an ETB. It can't really be like a previous enchantment that has some static ability, and they've done a few of those now up to this point. Things have changed, but at least at the time, the idea was that sagas go away, so you need to give them an end of the battlefield effect, essentially. And then you get some other effect on their second chapter, their third chapter, fourth chapter, whatever, they go away. But these became insanely good targets for Pixie, because oftentimes, or for a Skyfisher, because oftentimes a lot of the value on these cards is front-loaded in either the first chapter or the first and second chapters. And so you're not really losing that much if you need to Skyfisher back to your hand, or maybe you have an instant speed Skyfisher, and so it doesn't even matter, you can get everything. Sagas to me is where the floodgates kind of opened, and once they kind of saw what it was like to have these permanents with spell-like effects, it just kind of went everywhere. In LCI, we got all the craft artifacts like spring-loaded saw blades. We got cases and class enchantments. We got rooms and nowhere to run. And then in Aether Drift and Edge of Eternities, we just got, even though these aren't part of really the mechanics of the set, we just got a bunch of artifacts that look like spells, things like Grimbauble or Dubious Delicacy. So I think the trial cycle is kind of where they started to really dip their toes in, and then once sagas hit, the floodgates opened.
Yeah. And one thing I also, in addition to game object spell effects, one thing I wanted to mention is those 3 that you mentioned as underperformers, Pixie, Sun Procurian, and Ambrose Whiteheart. I know we could go really deep into this, and we're going to talk about what I'm about to speak about a little more in depth in the next section. But all 3 of those sets were also sets in which being just a mid-range deck wasn't really where you wanted to be. Mm-hmm. You wanted to go kind of way over the top of your opponent. Whereas Duskmourn, I think your value decks were typically more of like a 2-for-1 deck. Cards like Glimmerburst were fantastic, right? And you were contributing to the board. Whereas like part of the reason Nurturing Pixie, for example, wasn't particularly good in OTJ, in addition to the lack of really efficient game objects, that format was also just defined by going way over the top with like a Bonnie Paul or a Roxanne or something that just completely invalidated all the previous game actions. And Skyfishers are kind of quintessential mid-range. They're your like proactive, value-oriented +1s.
Totally agree, and yeah, it's definitely like a confluence of factors that made those weak. Really, all I'm trying to say is, for those of you out there who maybe cube a lot, and for you, these effects are kind of the boogeyman, I just want to make it clear that I don't think actually in a vacuum they're incredible cards. They're useful cards, but it really does depend on the environment that they're in.
Yeah, when they have downside, they are much worse. Okay, so let's talk about what makes this strategy so good in Peasant, because I am of the belief this is probably the big picture. I think I've come around to this as the best overall like archetype you can be doing in Peasant, not necessarily the best. I don't think necessarily the black-white deck specifically or any of these specific decks are the best or crazy overpowered. However, I think the current white game object mid-range deck is just the most consistent game plan, maybe would be the best way to put it. So broad picture, in more powerful environments, white tends to be the most narrow color. Sometimes red kind of gets there, but red usually at least has power. But white does 2 things most of the time in more powerful environments. It aggroes, and it makes tokens, and it like can provide some control support, right? With like wraths. It usually has bad removal. It's doing worse things than other colors when that plan A fails. You really need plan A to work out. But in Peasant, white has kind of everything. It has what I consider the best build arounds. It has lots of tools for card advantage in a variety of types. The Skyfishers just being one piece of that puzzle. The Skyfishers, whereas they get a little outgunned in terms of what they're doing in more powerful environments because you don't have as many game objects and you can't really take the tempo hit of playing them. They tend to be powerful, evasive, board impacting card advantage. And the removal in white tends to range from like pretty good to great. You don't actually see a giant uptick in the quality of removal when you move from Peasant to like our mainline environment, like you do with some of the other colors where some of the more powerful rare effects are very, very good interactive pieces. White doesn't really do that as much. Your upgrade to even like something like Path to Exile. If you're not playing Swords to Plowshares, which in our main line we don't, even something like Path to Exile is really efficient, but has downside, right? A lot of the white removal spells in more powerful environments have downsides. Whereas we're still playing Case of the Gateway Express at Peasant, and we're playing it in our mainline environment. And it's better in Peasant because the creatures are smaller. But it's actively great in Peasant. It's a good removal spell in our mainline and actively amazing in Peasant. And so the quality of removal white gets, I think, in Peasant is just generally pretty good, especially because you can run almost as many of those creature-based deal damage effects as you want, and every white deck will be able to take advantage of them.
Yeah, the removal's good. White gets to take advantage more in Peasant of the fact that it gets access to maybe the best efficient creatures. 1 and 2 drops, generally speaking, I'd say white tends to have the best creatures, both in terms of little bits of value generation like the Inspectors, but also in terms of potentially big power output like Neighborhood Guardian or Glyph Elemental. But the key thing I do think that historically has been missing from white is real sources of card advantage, and that is in large part, I think, where the Skyfishers they really fill that role really effectively. I was thinking about this for this episode is like how to think about the value that these Skyfishers are providing, and the card that I kept coming back to was Snapcaster Mage because for so long the power of Snapcaster Mage in powered formats is you're playing your 1 mana or 2 mana draw spell or removal spell. Then turn 3, turn 4, when you have a little bit more mana, you're able to play that Snapcaster. You get that value again, and you have some power toughness in play to boot. And that's exactly the play pattern of Skyfishers these days. You're playing some object that can do any number of things. It could be a removal spell like Nowhere to Run. It could be a draw spell like the recently released cryogenic, can't remember the second name, but the bauble that draws cards when it ETBs and leaves.
I think it's just Relic.
There we go. It could be something making bodies like Carrot Cake that we mentioned before. Like you can have these game objects that do really anything, and that turns your Skyfisher then into kind of an insane Snapcaster Mage, because part of the problem with Snapcaster Mage is it's kind of small for the amount of mana that you're spending on it. That's not really the problem for any of these Skyfishers. They tend to be well statted for the mana that you're investing into them. The downside, quote unquote, is that you have to have this permanent in play that you want to return to your hand. But assuming you just bake that in, then this becomes, compares favorably with Snapcaster, which for a long time was one of the better cards in even higher powered cubes. So what the Skyfishers are giving white, which already now has in Peasant really good removal and really good efficient aggro creatures, it's also giving white access to this card advantage that can work really effectively kind of no matter the role that you're taking in a game. And I think that going back to what you said earlier about these Skyfishers playing so well in mid-range spaces, that's really, I think, the key. They're cheap, often evasive creatures that can provide you card advantage in a lot of different ways, and they provide the mid-range player, especially good players, with a lot of different options depending on the role that they're taking in the game. If you're playing against the slower controlling decks, then you can beat down with your Sun Pearl Kieran and your Nurturing Pixie and your Skyfisher. If you need to be the control player against aggro deck, then you're picking up your Nowhere to Runs and turning all of your Skyfishers into essentially Ravenous Chupacabras. You can kind of do whatever's needed in the moment, and it's a very effective plan.
Yeah, I think that flexibility is really the key here, right? If you're playing against a control deck, like you can keep rebuying your Cryogenic Relic to keep the flood of creatures coming, or you can keep rebuying, something that your Carrot Cake to make more tokens, and all of that lets you get on top of the value that it's providing. And I think Pixie for me is the one that the more I've sat and thought on it, just how ridiculous the card is. I mean, when you don't have a downside, Pixie is a 1-mana 2/2 flyer with some amount of value stapled onto it, a +1 or a +2 or something like that, and that's just kind of insane. Like it really, when you consider that they still print Savannah Lions into retail, when you consider that you can get a 2/2 that flies. And has an abundance of synergies too, because one of the best things you can do for synergizing is like having one base power is really good because of cards like Vesperal Arc and I think it's Graceful Restoration. Having 1 mana cost means you get to be comboed now with cards like Starfield Shepherd or like
Lively Dirge.
What is the card? Lively Dirge. Thank you. That was actually the exact card I was thinking of. So these cards being cheap means that they get to go do those things. They get to be used with those things. In order to create more synergies on top. So part of the Skyfisher thing now is just how seamlessly it fits into the shells that you're running it in, on top of being good quality cards at this point.
I would say Pixie specifically, one mana is outrageous for almost any effect is the truth, and what you're getting from this being a 2/2 flyer and a removal spell, drawing a removal spell or drawing a good card to your hand, it's is definitely an efficiency monster.
Yeah, and one of the things I've said quite frequently on various episodes of the podcast is like things that cost 1 mana don't really have to do that much to be awesome.
Nope.
And so when you get effects like an Inspector, like a Pixie, like our Dragon's Rage Channeler or a Heartfire Hero that like does a lot for 1 mana, and maybe the Inspectors aren't quite pulling their weight in that pile of cards, but they are very good. But those other cards they're all game winning threats, right? And they cost 1 mana, and that's what makes them so crazy. Is they're so cheap and they're so efficient, and yet they have the ability in the right context to be the best card in your deck, and that's a really, really powerful thing for low cost cards. So one thing that's come up in our Discord specifically, and I know you've mentioned that the Pixie deck has become kind of, I don't know if it's necessarily you consider it a boogeyman, but become like kind of the best deck or the kind of presumed best deck in your format. A lot of our drafters are of the opinion that the white mid-range game object stuff, the black-white deck specifically, with all the looping that it can do with a couple of specific cards, is downright broken. And so I guess the question comes up of, is this whole Pixie Skyfisher thing a problem? Or because me and Tim do stand by the opinion that while we think it might have been, we just made a large update to the cube for what it's worth. And a non-Pixie deck did win our first draft. Not that is a large sample size of 1. But we're not of the opinion that it's a problem, and we are of the opinion that the Skyfisher thing is a feature we like rather than a bug to get rid of. That being said, we do acknowledge that it has been a little overrepresented and felt a little bit overpowered and possibly oppressive. But our goal here is not to remove those cards because they're really fun to play and we think we like the gameplay patterns that they create. So I guess I'll put the ball in your court here, Daneelius. You tend to have a much wider band of power in your cube. So is this whole thing a problem?
Yeah, I mean, I would never classify these sorts of things as that much of a problem. I don't mind power, I guess is how I'd put it. But yes, if gameplay is homogenizing too much, then you definitely want to address it. One thing I would say is, white-black in general has probably been one of, if not the best archetypes in my environment for the last long time. But it's neck and neck with black-red. And I think that the two things that those decks share, at least in my environment, is that they are just the best mid-range decks. And I think that by and large, Peasant is very much a mid-range dominated format, and so the archetypes that are best at doing the mid-range thing are going to perform the best. Now, I think that the Skyfishers that we've been talking about, they definitely contribute to white in general and white-black specifically being a very good mid-range color. But it's not, to me, it's less about the specifics of white or the Skyfishers and more just that white-black, when you combine Pixie with Nowhere to Run, you're doing really, really good mid-range stuff there. Now, in terms of like the problem, so I had a lot of thoughts here, and the first is just that a big part of whether or not a particular card or strategy is problematic in an environment comes down to the drafting proclivities of your players, and specifically like how high did they take these cards. If Nurturing Pixie was getting taken first pick every single draft, I don't think it would be as big of a problem. If in general the Skyfishers were all going as if they were some of the better cards in your white section, I don't think it'd be a problem. Tim mentioned this in chat that he was reviewing one of the drafts in your environment where Pixie won recently, and he saw like 3 different Skyfishers get taken by the same player in the first like 6 picks of the draft. It's like, okay, well, maybe the problem here is that people aren't respecting the card type enough. And I think that's always going to lead to issues, at least temporarily, until people react. And, if you have drafters who don't want to react to, metagame shifts, well, then the problem is going to persist. So that's just like a fact of life. Not much to be done about it. But one thing I'll say is that black, for the longest time in my environment, was considered the best color, maybe the best color by far. And because of that, it's now heavily drafted, and its win rate has dropped 3rd in my environment because it's drafted so much. The cards are fought over. And right now, the white cards are not fought over as much. And so white has moved into that number 1 position in terms of win rate in my environment. But once the white cards start getting fought over, I doubt that it's going to be able to hold that position. So I think it's always going to be a bigger problem for, in general, this sort of a question is going to matter more for people who have cubes that don't get drafted very much, because it's kind of hard for like a metagame to evolve in those sorts of environments. And you got to maybe take more of a scalpel and really be trimming around the edges to make sure that potential problematic things don't come up like this. But I would just say the more your cube gets drafted, I just don't worry about this stuff almost at all, because the metagame shifts and theoretically at least draft tends to be self-correcting. In terms of, okay, but let's assume we're not going to have a self-correcting metagame. Is this a problem? And what I would say is that there is a fundamental issue for Peasant in my mind, where it is very difficult to go over the top in all capitals of a mid-range deck. It's just we don't have tools like, say, a Bonnie Paul in OTJ to really go way over the top. So, what are some of the ways you can try to go over the top of a really strong mid-range deck? Well, you could try to draw a lot of cards, and so blue theoretically could do that in Peasant with stuff like Lorien's Escape, Lorien Revealed. You could try to go way under, though I would say, in my experience, trying to get under these mid-range decks, these really, really strong, heavy removal mid-range decks, even in my environment where I think aggro is more supported than yours, has not worked super well. But that's always a bit of a coin flip. If you're playing white-red aggro against a mid-range deck and you're on the play and you curve out, like sometimes you just win. It's just, regardless of their strategy. So, those are 2 options. Or the other way would be to fight it with more mid-range, which is, again, why I think black-red is kind of up there with white-black in terms of well-performing archetypes. So I think there's a broad question of, like, how do you fight strong mid-range in Peasant that doesn't really have an easy answer to it. And then there's another question of, like, all right, are these individual cards a problem? And I would say if recursion, whether it be, permanents on the battlefield or cards in graveyard, if recursion in general is a big problem in your environment, there are things you can do to try to fight back against that. So I guess that's maybe a slightly different answer to the question of, is this a problem? Like, I'm going straight to solutions, but I don't think it's an unsolvable problem, I guess is how I'd put it.
Yeah, and I like the idea of being more solution oriented. So, our goal here wasn't, because in the past we've cut some cards that we considered individually problematic, right? For us, that was a card like Rise to the Tides, that it felt like just put so much power into play that you had like one turn to win the game. Or a card like Balmor that might, with a lot of board states, would just kill you through a removal spell. But it does feel that the Pixies and the Skyfisher type thing is just not that. It's not the same kind of bad beats. It's just a good value card. And so the steps we wanted to take were steps towards, like you said, they're finding solutions. And some of the things you mentioned here is of like having more exile-based removal. We've been a little more open to graveyard hate lately to try to break up these loops. And specifically, we tried to juice some of the other archetypes in our cube in a recent update. And I think one of the plays we made was putting some extra cards into this like black-red space, partly making it a little more flexible with a little bit of artifact support so that there would be more colors that might fight over these artifact synergy pieces, but also adding cards like Junkyard Genius and Spawn Gang Commander that contributed to the sort of big game that the black-white deck often plays, and to be able to help kill them. So one of the things with black-white is very frequently they don't actually run that many removal spells a lot of times. They do have some. But there aren't infinite number of these game objects. There aren't infinite number of these core Skyfishers, and a lot of their cards are going towards creating these synergy packages and like these board presence. And so if both players have a reasonable amount of resources, we've noticed black-red kind of just beats up on the black-white deck a lot of times. The black-red deck, specifically with the sack synergies and the pingers and the blood artists and stuff, if both players just have a bunch of game objects in play, like the black-red deck wins that because every time you take a trade, they drain you for 2. And you just can't do that. So like you can't chump block that deck into oblivion, which is one of the ways that, for example, the green decks have been losing to the pixie deck, is that the deck just creates a bunch of chump blockers and it can like buy time to kill you in the air while it's chump blocking your big ground creatures that don't necessarily have trample. And that's not like deterministic or anything. These are just kind of play patterns we've noticed. But our idea was kind of juice up that Jund space, that red-black, the green-red decks, and that sort of space to try to give them more tools for fighting the black-white deck because they've lost some tools over time. And part of that was kind of taking a page out of your book, I think, and giving aggro a little bit of juice. Like we're taking steps towards making aggro feel a little more playable because a lot of our players don't like it. And that's another thing you mentioned, player proclivities. Our players are all a bunch of mid-range gamers. They like to play dirtly 2, 3 color decks, 4 color decks. Persian on our server is notorious for just drafting every land in any given draft and just playing 5 color, even if it's not the correct call ever. So I think you have to recognize that if you don't have players that are willing to force the issue by drafting aggro pretty consistently, and you don't have the tools to really have a go way over the top style deck, then mid-range is just the best thing to be doing. And this looks currently like the best mid-range deck.
Yeah, I'd say white-red is the most drafted archetype in my cube. And what that does to the environment is it just means that kind of the fun police is always lurking, and it puts a little bit of pressure on people to try to get on board faster, even if they are playing a more dirtily grindy deck. They still have to have an early game plan. But going back really quickly, I do think what you said about black white not necessarily always having tons of removal spells, I tend to agree. Sometimes I definitely have seen black white removal piles that do well as well, but sometimes what I do notice with these Skyfisher decks is they really are trying to get into these kind of looping situations where they play their Nowhere to Run, then they return it with a Skyfisher, they play it again, then the Skyfisher dies, then they return that, then they return the Nowhere to Run, they play the Nowhere to Run again, and the amount of value they generated now in the sequence is kind of outrageous. And all that could be stopped, or a lot of that can be stopped if you just exile the first Skyfisher that gets played, or you exile the target that the Skyfisher has in response, to it entering the battlefield. So I do think that exile plays a pretty big role here, to the point that I'm seriously considering a card like Suplex, which for me, I hadn't. If you ignore the value of the exile line there, to me it just doesn't really get there. I'm not even a fan of a braid, to be honest with you, and I see Suplex as kind of a bad braid. But if this is a problem archetype in your environment, I definitely think that something like Suplex should be investigated. Definitely playing some amount of incidental graveyard hate. I think this is a good idea in almost any peasant environment these days, because not only are there some decks that are built almost entirely around graveyard recursion, it just does give you game against that single point in time where if the Skyfisher player is able to return that one Skyfisher, then they're going to generate 4 or 5 cards off of it, and you can just tag it at the exact right moment. That's a game-winning play often. So I do think that increasing the amount of graveyard, or just in general exile that you have access to, matters a lot. And then I would say a thing that you might just have to consider is the density of Skyfishers in your environment and the density of spells as game objects in your environment. Because going back to what I said at the beginning, I do think that these Skyfishers rely on these game objects. You have to have, if all you're doing is returning your 4-mana creature that has value on ETB with your Skyfisher, I don't really think you're getting ahead very often in that sort of a scenario. I think you really need the 2 mana especially, but in some cases 3 mana, really effective spells as game objects, cards like Elspeth's Nightmare or Nowhere to Run. And you can just decrease the density of those effects in your environment. Now, the problem I have is I love those cards, because not only do they work well with Skyfishers, they work well with all kinds of cards. And that's also the problem with reducing the density of Skyfishers, is that they work well with all kinds of cards. And it's almost unfortunate that there is like a deck that's built around Skyfishers, at least in your environment. I wouldn't say that because I have a larger environment and I have maybe a similar number of Skyfishers, it's not very often that you'll have an entire deck built around Skyfishing, but you could say that there will often be decks where recursion is a really important part of what they're doing, and there's some combination of, Skyfishers and carrion cruisers, or the new, Fell Grav Ship, or, Dune Drifters or whatever, where definitely recursion is a big part of what they're doing. But yeah, what I was going to bring up there is the fact that I have a larger cube and I'm playing kind of a similar number of Skyfishers or Skyfisher adjacent cards as y'all might be one of the reasons why I haven't felt like there is much of a Skyfisher problem in our environment. White-black is good because it's just a really good mid-range color pair, and that's in part because of Skyfishers, but there's a lot of other reasons for that. So I do think, one of the ways to address this problem isn't to axe Skyfishers as a card type from your environment, but maybe to decrease the density a little bit.
Yeah, and it doesn't ever feel like a super high density, but yeah, when you're playing with a 360 card cube, and we have, I guess, like 4 to 5 cards that I would say are like Skyfisher adjacent. Maybe you can make an argument for like slightly higher. But yeah, in a 360 card cube, that means you're going to see a lot of those. I do want to harken back, especially that point you made earlier about taking these cards as if they were premier picks. Please start doing that, guys. Just take these cards as if they're the top, 3 cards in the cube that you think they are.
To put a point on that, I'm just pulling up, because I keep grades on all my cards in my cube. These grades are derived by interviewing my players, seeing what they feel, and then trying to kind of aggregate that together into a largely vibes based rating. But for me, I've got really 3 white pixies as 3 of the top 10 white cards in my cube, and I also got other cards that are pixie like that are at kind of that B level rating or higher, which for me just means pretty happy to first pick it out of almost any pack. So yeah, I mean, I treat these cards as definitely as first pickable cards. And if you're in an environment where people don't, then yeah, that certainly could be a problem.
I've got one last thing before we do an activity here on the Jank Tank, a first that I'm sure the fans will love. I have some deck lists, and again, I'm going to try what Tim and I have been trying to do is make sure we link the show notes at the end of episodes now, so you can follow along if you would like. And so I've got some pictures of deck lists that have trophied or have looked really impressive. Most of these are trophy lists. I did pull one that was from an episode that Tim and I did where I drafted for a couple of weeks, just drafted like Boros game objects, which is very much a mid-range deck in the style of these black-white decks, just from a different flavor or angle. And it kind of made a nice little pattern where I've got 4 decks from our cube. So the first one that we have is a traditional Esper deck. It's like mostly black-white, playing a few blue cards for like card advantage and an additional pixie effect. And then I've got what's mostly a blue-white deck. So we do have a blue-white artifacts theme in our cube, and it's splashing for a few black cards, including an ambitious Grim Bauble splash. And then the Boros deck that I drafted and a recent green-white trophy deck. And what you should notice about all of these decks is that they are all pretty heavy white decks. The secondary or tertiary colors are largely that. They're the core of the deck in most of these cases is just a white mid-range deck. And then finally, I've got a list from your cube, which if you'll look at some of the cards, it looks maybe a little less synergistic, just good cards all top to bottom. One card that I see that I really like here that I kind of wish we ran is Okuba Reckoner Raid. It's one of my favorite cards from Neo Kamigawa. Just such a ridiculously efficient card. If you remember the card Vampire Spawn, which was the original 17 lands data darling, Okuba Reckoner Raid is kind of like if that card had one mana cost and menace, which is not reasonable at all.
Yeah, that's a favorite for sure. But yeah, I mean, what this deck is largely doing, if you look at it, it's got a pixie, it's got a stockpiling celebrant, which is another type of Skyfisher. It's got a Sun Pearl Kirin, so it's got those 3 pixie effects, and then it's got a Sunblessed Healer, which can rebuy the pixies from the graveyard. It's also got a Dune Drifter, which can rebuy the pixies from the graveyard. So what this deck actually is, if you kind of, in my opinion, it's kind of just an aggro slanted mid-range deck, but it has this ability to grind so incredibly well because of those 3 Skyfishers and then the 2 ways to buy them back. It can go, quite a long time if need be. It certainly can play a 2-for-1 game, but it doesn't have to. It can also play aggressively, and that's one of the benefits of these cards like Pixie and Kieran, is that they're just solid attackers on their own while also providing you this value.
Yeah, the flexibility is the king here. Like they're just more copies of whatever the best card in the given matchup is. Okay, so what we're gonna do with the remainder of this episode is we are going to conduct the first ever Jank Diver Core Skyfisher tier list. People love tier list, right, Daneelius?
Absolutely.
So in order to facilitate this, we are going to leave it running here on the podcast. I think I will decide that here shortly. But I'm definitely recording a video of this to have potentially on the YouTube channel. And we're just going to talk through the core Skyfishers that are available on the client and try to come to a consensus sort of ranking for them. And just see how this goes. So I have pulled up 21 cards that we agreed to consider Skyfishers, and by we agreed, I mean Daneelius didn't complain too hard after he pointed out that one of the Skyfishers that I had was actually a Mana War, and that if we wanted to do that, we had to include a large number of cards. So I took off, what was the card called, Daneelius? Was it Hot Shot? Hot Shot something. Well, it's like a 6-mana Mana War that if you bounce your creature, you investigate.
Yeah, there's enough. I think there's a lot of qualms that the average tier list enjoyer could have with the selection, but if we went with the full tier, Skyfisher adjacent card list, we would be here for 3 days.
Yeah, so the cards we've selected are on the Arena client at common or uncommon, and they all, as part of their effect, require you to return a creature or permanent to your hand. Some of them are only creatures. Some of them are only enchantments, but they all do require you to bounce a card of yours, and they cannot interact with your opponent's cards. Let me just double check and make sure that's true. Yeah, okay. Just double check.
Probably.
All right, I'm gonna move these around so that we don't have all the good ones here at the very beginning. I had them in a specific.
Is it a thing if it can't be tier listed? That's really the question. I would say no. It's not.
Yeah, you can literally tier list everything. There's an infinite number. See, I already talked about the Jank Diver Gaming tier list cinematic universe, where we'll tier list the tier list. We'll rank our tier list videos once we have enough of them. Okay,
tier list inception.
So I figure it's only fair to start this list off with the technically the one that started it all. If we want to get real technical, Shrieking Drake is the original core Skyfisher, but we're going to start with the one that the archetype is named after. We're going to start with core Skyfisher. So let's talk about this card, Daneelius, because I want to put it in A tier. I think this card used to be the gold standard for these effects. 2/3 flyer for 2 mana was completely ridiculous when it was printed in terms of stat lines to like what you got. Even amongst rares, it was pretty good. I do think now it can't be an S tier because there are effects that I consider better than it. But I do think it is at the top of A tier. And if you want to include synergies with other specific cards, if you include its Oketra Monument synergy, I would accept an inclusion into S tier.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing I'll say is I'm going to be ranking these in general for Peasant Cube, not necessarily like, okay, I'm in a deck where I'm trying to maximize the Skyfisher effects and then ranking them according to this. So just in general for Cube, I would say Skyfisher is probably an A for me. I don't actually play Skyfisher in my Cube because it's not in my card pool, but I do play Fear of Isolation, which is effectively the same card. There's some slight differences, and I think Fear of Isolation is very good, Forspicable. I wouldn't put it at S tier, but I definitely would put it at A tier.
Okay, yeah. I think another couple of things about this card, pick up lands. Not all of them can do that. And I also wanted to stop and just take for a minute because obviously people have seen a million tier list videos by now. But one thing I wanted to say is we probably want to define our parameters here. So for me, S tier is best of the best. These are the ones that have some sort of unique utility or are just absolutely premium. A tier are the really good ones. B tier are like good in certain spots. C tier are kind of bland, and the D tier are kind of in like the thoroughly outclassed niche tier. Are those acceptable terms?
That's fine with me.
Okay, so we'll start with core Skyfisher in A tier, and then we'll go to the newest Skyfisher, which if you think power creep is overrunning Magic, can I introduce you to, oh dear, I should have printed the name of these cards. I don't remember what this one's called. Give me a second. Let me check. I have the list in our in our group chat. You can tell we're very professional here at Jank Diver Gaming and Co. This one is called Exosuit Savior. And it is a 2/2 flyer for 3 mana with basic core Skyfisher text.
Fix Skyfisher, basically.
Yeah,
It's a May. It's a May.
Oh, is it a May? It is a May. Okay, yeah, it's return up to 1 target creature. So you don't have to. You could just play a Windrake. I think this is D tier. I think this card is kind of awful. I don't really see any reason to run this over the bevy of interesting and good Skyfishers that are on the client, unless you are specifically gating yourself for power reason, which to me is the epitome of D tier.
The whole point of a Skyfisher is that you're getting good stats for the mana invested, and you're not getting that here, so I don't know why you'd ever play it.
Fair enough. Okay, next up we have Rescuer Sphinx. This is an old one from War of the Spark. So Rescuer Sphinx is 2 blue for a 3/2 flyer, and it has flying. I think I just said that. As Rescuer Sphinx enters the battlefield, you may return a non-land permanent you control to its owner's hand. If you do, it enters with a +1/+1 counter. Now, this one these days, I would not consider above rate stats. I would consider 4 mana for even 4/3 worth of stats to be on a flyer to be a little below rate. And so we're not getting great value. But I do think there is more incentive to play this one because of the color that it's in. And I think being in blue, this effect was pretty rare for quite a while. We have a number of these now, but I still think I wouldn't put this in the completely and totally outclassed D tier. I think I would have this in like C tier, as like I wouldn't play it in a lot of cubes, but I could see reasons to play it.
Yeah, I think C is probably fair. I still would suggest there's not great reason to play it in a cube unless you're intentionally depowering your environment. But if you are, then yeah, I think this could at least be a passable version of the effect. But, double blue, 4-drop, your 4-drops are already supposed to be giving you value. The fact that this one, you kind of have to set it up, not ideal. So it's okay.
Yeah, I just to be clear, C tier are not cards that will make most cubes, I don't think. Yeah, but there are reasons beyond very niche ones. Okay, next up we have Rescuer Chinga, which I think there's an argument that the Chinga archetype or Twinga archetype is actually just it's a sub archetype of Skyfishers. They're kind of a different effect, and you get opportunities for even more value out of them. And I had a really tough time placing this one because I do feel like it is outclassed, like directly outclassed by multiple cards on this list. But I also couldn't bring myself to put this card into C tier because I still feel like this card's just really good.
Oh yeah, I definitely wouldn't put it in C. I'd definitely put it in B. And yeah, I agree. The thing that the Twingas do is that they can be cast at flash speed, which matters a whole lot, especially given the fact that one of if not the single best target for your Skyfishers is Nowhere to Run, which also can be cast at flash speed. So yeah, I think Twinga is great, and the only reason why it's not in my cube anymore is because we got a strictly better version.
Yeah. Speaking of, this one is not the strictly better versions, but we will, I think, get the full range of kind of power level barometers here. We have Sun Pearl Kieran, which is from Tarkir Dragonstorm. So it's 1 and a white for a 2/1 flash flyer. And when it ETBs, you may return up to 1 target non-land permanent you control to its owner's hand. If that card was a token, you draw a card. And Daneelius, is there anything stopping us from just putting this into S tier and saying read the card and understanding why it's good?
No, but I'd go a step further, and I'd say that this is the clear best Skyfisher, not very close.
Interesting. Okay, got clear best Skyfisher, because I actually don't have it as the clear best Skyfisher.
I'm aware, yeah, but that's a point of contention. I think,
yeah,
but again,
okay.
If you're ignoring the fact, like if we're not assuming that we're already in a space where we are intentionally trying to get as many Skyfishers into our deck as possible, like we're not necessarily a Skyfisher deck, then I think this is just very clearly the best Skyfisher because it goes in every single deck, and it's going to be one of your better cards in every single deck. Even if you have no permanents to return, it's still a 2-mana 2/1 flash flyer that protects your creatures, even from removal if you're playing any amount of tokens. I mean, I've seen this card sacrifice tokens probably more often even than its return permanents to your hand just to get the card draw. So I think this is the most flexible Skyfisher. Does the most. Yeah, I think it's the best.
I do agree it's the most flexible. I think the Chinga text of being able to pick up a card in response to removal comes up more often than you believe. It's got the most upside of any Skyfisher because of that. With the draw, I just don't think it's clear best. I think it probably is the best one or tied for best one. But I think the one we'll have coming up here in a minute is one that I would argue might be a little better. But first, let's take a break with Aviary Mechanic. This was another hard one for me to place, and I think I'm going to probably change my mind on where I placed it. I originally wanted to place it in B tier because 2 mana is cheap, and a big difference for me in my initial, like, this is my 2-minute tier list, was the cards that were cheap were all really high, and the cards that cost like 3 or more were all really low. I think I want to move this down to C tier though, because I don't really see a reason to run this over any of the Chingas, and multiple Skyfisher variants are better than it, which to me sounds like a C tier card to me.
I would go further and I would put it in D, and my reasoning is basically the difference between returning a creature to your hand or returning any permanent to your hand is massive. It's like the whole point of, a lot of what we've been talking about this episode is what makes these cards good is how many of these really solid game object or spells as game objects we've been getting, and the fact that Mechanic doesn't really get to interact with most of those. Yes, it gets to interact with creatures, but the creatures. Oh well, then I'm an idiot. Never mind. All right. Cut everything I just said from the episode. You had me second guessing
myself. I double checked it just now.
Of course, I have to read the card to explain the card. Okay, never mind. Yeah, it's a C.
I didn't read this one, to be fair. To be fair, I didn't read this card, so you couldn't explain it. Aviary Mechanic, for those at home, is from Kaladesh, and it's 1 and a white for a 2/2 with Core Skyfisher text as a May ability. So it's a bear that returns a permanent to your hand. If you want to put this one in C tier, I think I'm fine with that.
No, I thought this card was totally different. Never mind. This is where you come for the expert peasant analysis. No, I think C at best still though, because it can't be cast at flash speed and its body is pretty unimpressive.
Yeah, I agree. You're not really getting away with anything on this one. I'm fine moving this to C tier, having thought about it a little bit. You're just not getting away with anything, even if it is cheap. All right, next up, we have the one that I was arguing was the best Skyfisher, which is Nurturing Pixie from OTJ. So it's a single white mana for a 1/1 flyer, and when it ETBs, you may return up to 1 non-land permanent to your hand. And if you do, the Nurturing Pixie enters with a +1/+1 counter. Now, to me, this is the best one because what you're looking for with Skyfishers is you're looking for good stats for the mana. And if you show me a creature in Magic that has a better stat line than 2/2 for 1 mana with flying, even today, that doesn't have a huge hoop to jump through, it is not entirely common. I think this card is incredibly good. It synergizes with a bunch of new cards that we get in every set that interact with low mana value or low power or, kind of permanents. It has a bunch of random synergies. It does require you to be a little more committal than the Curate. I will give you that. I will grant that. But I think once you're looking for some synergy at all, I think Pixie just jumps up. It's super, super efficient. Like the number of plays that you get to do this that you can't even do with Kieran into the early game is super valuable. I would settle for it's tied as the best Skyfisher, but I think I would. I think I'm gonna ready to argue a little bit that it's at least tied for best.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great card. I definitely think it's a great card. I would put it, kind of bottom of S tier. Really, what I prefer is more top of A tier. I've seen enough Pixies not do the job that's kind of where I'm down a little bit on them. Like I've seen Pixies be often enough just a Windrake, where it's picking up your 2-drop and you're replaying your 2-drop. And the biggest difference between Pixie and say Skyfisher is that you can't return that land, and you might think that that's not a big deal, but I mean I've been in situations definitely where Skyfishers are picking up lands either to make mana, which is like a really relevant upside of those cards, or just because you don't have another target because things aren't going well for you because you're under pressure and you can't afford to pick up some of the power and toughness you've already put into play. So I think the card is great, and yes, when things are going well for you, it's the best. I agree. I definitely agree with that. When your deck is maximally synergizing around game objects, when you have a thing in your opening hand that you can play to then immediately return, then I think definitely Pixie is probably the best out of all of these. But it's also the one that maybe asks the most out of you, and so I would put it at a tier below Sunpro Kieran. But I'm not. We don't need to fight that much about it. I do think it's a great card, and I wouldn't be super upset with. I'm not going to be super upset with anything, but I can see bottom of S. But for me, Sunpro is just a different category card. It's just a tier above.
Fair enough. I will put it for the sake of this tier list below, though. If I were personally ranking it, I would still probably have it above some Procure. But that being said, they're both amazing cards. I have one other card on this list that I think we can argue for S tier. I could see it bumping down a tier, but I think it's a pretty hard sell. That being said, the next card is not it. So next up we have Sticky Tongue Sentinel from Bloomburrow. So Sticky Tongue Sentinel is 2 and a green for a 3/3 with reach. And when it enters, return up to one other target permanent you control to its owner's hand. This one can hit lands. So my initial thoughts on this one were that the Sticky Tongue Sentinel made it into A tier. The reason being is that while Sticky Tongue Sentinel is a little expensive, it's not an egregiously good rate. It is a pretty good rate. Reach is an undervalued mechanic, particularly in Modern Magic. 3 toughness and 3 power on a reach creature means it blocks most of the relevant flyers. And it's in a color that, outside of Temur Sabertooth, that we don't have on the client and also only works with creatures, and is also 4 mana plus a bunch of activations. There aren't a lot of this effect. Like, this is a pretty unique effect. And so at the moment, if we had more competition, I could see bumping it down. But it's hard for me to drop it below, like, bottom of A, top of B is probably about as low as I would want to go on this one, just due to how unique it is on its color.
Yeah, I was thinking more bottom of B, top of C, but so I think there's different considerations. One is, you're right, it's pretty unique for green, but part of where I'm like not that sold on that aspect of it is green's probably the worst in terms of, spells as game objects. That being said, if you have a small cube especially, then that kind of gets thrown on its head because of Hunter's Talent, which is probably the card that you're looking to pick up with this. So, I think it's a solid card. I think, in general, I'm always going to have a preference for cheaper cards. So I have a hard time ranking it, at similar levels as these 1 and 2 mana Skyfishers. But, somewhere around B, I think is fine. Okay. I'm generally happy to play it. It's just, I do think that green suffers from a lack of really good targets that white really doesn't suffer from.
Yeah, notably, we do play in a small cube and have Hunter's Talent in the cube. So
absolutely, yeah.
Your mileage may vary. Next up, we have what will hopefully be a pretty quick one. We have Mischievous Mutt. Is that the name of it? Mischievous Pup, excuse me. 2 and a white for a 3/1 with flash. When this creature enters, return up to one other target permanent you control to its owner's hand. So I'm caught a little here between thinking that this card is really, really bad and didn't play well in MKM. And also thinking that it's hard for me to put the actual Chinga variants into D tier. So I kind of had this at the bottom of C tier. What are your thoughts?
I don't think I have as big a problem as you do as putting this into D tier.
I was trying to keep like the D tier from being just completely full. I'm trying to avoid that, but yeah, I don't think this card is good.
I don't know if you noticed, but it has 1 toughness and it doesn't get like a counter when you do things with it. So yeah, that's kind of just unacceptable to me.
Okay, fair enough. You've sold me. I didn't take much to get me out of the bottom of C tier and into D tier. Would you put it above or below a Windrake?
Oh man,
below. Ugh.
Probably below. Probably below. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think I'd put it below Windrake now that I'm thinking about it.
3/1. Okay. I hate 1 toughness, man. You know this about me.
Yeah. So just to be clear to the folks at home, I think I've mentioned this a few times. This when I say I have an initial grade on a card, that was like I put together the tier list in like 2 minutes, very very quickly. All right. So next up we have let me confirm the name on this card. I've been doing this in advance on a couple of them that I didn't know, but this is Loyal Griff. So this is 2 and a white for a 2/2 flyer with flash. And when it enters, you may return another creature you control to its owner's hand. So you have to ask yourself the question of, is targeting only creatures but getting flash enough to pull it out of the D tier over the other Windrake? And I'm not sure that it is now that we're really talking, now that we're going to be talking about this.
Yeah, I'd say the answer to that is no. The only pause I have is like, is it really that much worse than the Rescuer Sphinx we have at C? It's like, I think both those cards are kind of so yeah, bottom of C, top of D, I'd be fine with either one of those. Okay.
I'm going to tentatively put it at the bottom of C only because I like the Chinga text and I really, really do not like Exosuit. And I think I don't know, maybe it's better than Mischievous Pup.
Well, like comparing it to Aviary Mechanic, it basically has flash and flying for 1 more mana. Did you say it can hit non-creatures? I can't.
No, it can only hit creatures, so that's
Oh,
pretty.
in that
pretty
case,
steep
yeah,
comp.
just slam dunk D. Just put that.
Slam
in.
dunk D. All right, yeah,
slam
I'll put it
dunk.
at the top of D because flash on this kind of effect is still pretty good.
Sure.
Not that we're really splitting hairs here now.
Yeah.
All right,
the whole
so
point of
next up
materials.
we have what I think is the actual factual classic. Is this Onslaught that this card originally came out in? It's Shrieking Drake, so it's a single blue mana for a 1/1 flyer, and when it enters, you return a creature you control to its owner's hand. All right, so this card's not good.
Whoa.
But
I don't know that's
it costs
true.
1 mana.
I'm not sure that I would say it's no good. It's just a combo card, and if you don't have combos, then yeah, it's no good. It's like my understanding, at least, is there's combos with this. I don't play in formats where there's combos with this, so sure, if you want to play a combo in your cube for some reason, and this is a part of it, then yeah. Otherwise, no, it's terrible.
Yeah, I again initially had this in B tier, which I think in retrospect is way too high, and I was probably considering the combo implications of stuff like Oketcher's Monument. And there's actual real combos with this card, but Oketcher's Monument's kind of like the peasant level combo. I think at 1 mana, I don't know, it's so bad. 1/1 flyer is so bad.
I think given the combo implications, I'm fine with C tier. I can't.
C-tier?
I think in the average cube, there's no way it's getting up to like B tier level.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, so next up we have Stockpiling Celebrant, which is from Wilds of Eldraine. And it is 2 and a white for a 3/2. And when it ETBs, you may return another target non-land permanent you control to its owner's hand. If you do, scry 2. I had this at B tier, but kind of at the bottom, and I actually think this card's pretty good. Like, it's kind of awkward because you're not really getting away with anything at 3/2, but I do have recollections of Scry 2 being really powerful when you were in the kind of grindy and attrition games that sometimes these decks find themselves in.
Yeah, I mean, Scry 2 is the whole thing here. That being said, I would not put it up in B. I think it has similar value as, say, Sticky Tongue Sentinel. I think the 3/3 reach body does quite a lot there and can return lands where this can't. And, one thing about returning lands is not just about making mana. It's also that you can pick up MDFCs, which is definitely a relevant upside. So I would put this at B, and I'd be okay with bottom of sorry, put this in B and be okay with the bottom of B.
You said C, bottom of B?
Sorry, B, bottom of B. That would be my inclination.
B, bottom of B. Okay, sorry, I thought you said you didn't want to put this in B. Okay.
No. I at first I was going to put it in C, but honestly, I think that the Scry 2 does matter quite a lot.
Okay. So next up, we have Emancipation Angel. So is this Double Masters that this came out in, or Jumpstart? Maybe it's Jumpstart. So it's 1 white for a 3/3 flying angel, and when it enters the battlefield, you return a permanent you control to its owner's hand. No May here. That being said, I mean, it's kind of hard because we're judging these on modern stat lines, which is a little awkward, but like 3/3 for 3 and flying stats is not terrible. It's not like crazy getting away with things, but it is still not something you see all the time, right?
Well, so first of all, I'm very disappointed that you forgot the limited All-Star set Avacyn Restored, which is where this card was printed.
Oh, you're right.
Shocking.
Okay, so the card symbol I had on here was for Jumpstart, but you're right. Yeah. This is Avacyn Restored, which wow, that was a million years ago.
In one of the most rancid limited sets of all time.
Oh, yeah, that set sucked.
No, I mean, for me, it's not about the body size; it's about the double white, and I need an enormous amount out of my double pipped cards to want to play them, and this isn't enough. So for me, this is probably a D. Even if you read it as better than these other Ds, double white is a huge cost. And Rescuer Sphinx also has double blue, which is part of the reason why I don't like that card that much.
I'm going to ask, is this card actually worse than Rescuer Sphinx? I mean, it's in a color that has more of this effect, but I kind of think bottom of C, I do think this is better than the trash down at the bottom of the beep. I think bottom of C, not that these are cards you're likely to make your cube, but I do think Emancipation Angel is better than the stuff we've got floating in D.
I guess what I'd say is that to me, double pip almost makes it more of a 4-drop anyways. And so it's basically a form. It's like Rescuer Sphinx, but slightly different.
You're right.
So fine. I think that's fine. Yeah.
You're not playing these cards anyways in the bottom.
Please don't play these cards. Yeah.
Yeah, these cards, I will admit, these are the kind of cards I do love getting printed. I know we're kind of bad-mouthing them a little bit, but I do actually really like the Cs, and even some of the Ds, though really it's the C-level cards that I like getting printed because they allow for power modulation when you're trying to do more thematic cubes. Because a lot of times you're looking for an effect, but you really don't want to put some Procurant in like your Neo Set cube, for example.
For sure.
So I really like these cards existing, even if we're kind of crapping on them. All right, so next up we have, God, what is this card's name? I thought I had it memorized.
Geothermal Kami, I believe.
Thank you, Geothermal Kami. 3 and a green for a 4/3. And when it enters the battlefield, you may return an enchantment you control to its owner's hand. If you do, gain 3 life. All right, so what are we thinking about this one, Daneelius?
I think that it is true that oftentimes the permanent you want to return to your hand is an enchantment. However, it isn't always, and that's kind of the death knell for this card. So it's like if you're playing an enchantment-focused green section or an enchantment-focused cube, then this is maybe gets all the way up to like, I don't know, B tier. Gain 3 life is a big deal, but on a card like this, especially that's giving you card advantage. But given the fact that the card I'm going to want to return is often not an enchantment, for me, it's got to be D.
Okay, well, how would you feel about putting it at the bottom of C tier? Because it does see, like, we play this in our Neo set cube, still, obviously, it's a Neo card.
Yeah.
But I think there is room to play this, like you said, in Enchantment Matters cube. And I think, like, these D cards are cards that you're just, like, really never putting in a cube.
That's fair. And, you know, Shrieking Drake is a card that certainly will get played in some cubes that are trying to push combo synergies at least. So it makes sense that the C tier is both, like, misses the mark or needs some kind of specific synergies to get played.
Yeah. C tier is your power modulation or specific synergies tier.
There you go. Yeah.
So next up is one of the ones that everybody loves from M20, Yarok's Wavecrasher. So it's
Everybody
3 and a blue. For when it enters the battlefield, return another creature you control to its owner's hand. So this one kind of hits all the marks of being bad. It's not a particularly great stat line. It only returns creatures. It doesn't have flash. Does this card do anything?
Nope, nothing at all. It's terrible. Very bad. What
All
were
right.
they? Oh, I guess the point is it's an elemental, and this set had like an elementals entering the battlefield theme. But the fact that it's required, it's not a May. How? Oh man, I guess a May. Then you have a 4-mana 4/4 blue creature, and that was unacceptable. You know, 6 years ago, and this got printed or whatever. I guess.
I guess so. Please don't remind me that the year 2020 was almost
God.
like 5-6 years ago. Okay, so we then come to Storm Sculptor, which is 3 and a blue for a 3/2, can't be blocked, and when it enters, return a creature you control to its owner's hand. I'm going to save us a lot of conversation and just throw it down here next to Yarok's Wavecrasher, unless you have a serious.
Love it.
Okay. Then we have Ambrosia. Is it Ambrosia or Ambrosia?
Ambrosia Whiteheart. Yeah.
Ambrosia Whiteheart. Thank you. It is 1 and a white for a 2/2 with flash, and when it enters, you may return another permanent you control to its owner's hand. And if you're thinking that sounds an awful lot like Rescuer Chinga, don't worry. It has landfall, and when land enters, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn, which kind of sounds like is completely irrelevant, like the way I'm saying it. But you know, getting to 3 power is like kind of relevant. Actually, it attacks through a lot more stuff than Shinga does. It's not quite as much of a complete like dud on a lot of boards, but it's not. It's not a huge improvement.
I mean, I'd say it's a pretty relevant improvement. Like you were talking about white, black, and black, red, or white, black as being kind of a big game deck, and I would say I don't think it necessarily always has to play that way. I think it can often play more as a small game deck where you're playing a lot of removal and you're using your Skyfishers to pick up your nowhere to runs or your cases or whatever to you know just be all chupacabras. I went the whole podcast without saying this, but to me the best version of these Skyfisher decks are white, black, all chupacabras, where just, you know, everything you play ends up effectively being a chupacabra. So in those sorts of games, you might only have a couple creatures in play, and the fact that this can attack sometimes is like a 4/2, I think is actually very relevant. It's not it's not a huge power spike, but it's relevant, and I think a clear A. Doesn't quite get up to the top level, but definitely better than Twingo, obviously, and enough better that I think it belongs in a higher tier.
Okay, I haven't played a ton with this one because we did skip it because we had access to some Procure, so we chose not to run this one. So, and in Final Fantasy, the Final Fantasy set it was just not where you want it to be necessarily. So I haven't had a ton of experience with this one, but if you're selling that the extra stats are enough to be a whole tier above it, I'm fine with that.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, so I'm really hoping we have a disagreement on this one because next up is Indoctrination Attendant. So it is 3 and a white for a 3/4. With Toxic, and when it enters, you may return another permanent you control to its owner's hand. If you do, create a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature token with Toxic 1. All right, so the downside on this card first, 3/4 for 4 is not a good stat line. Toxic is an irrelevant mechanic in most settings. The might can't block, so it's almost exclusively just you're getting an artifact game object. Daneelius, is that enough to pay 4 mana for?
Yes, this is a good card. I would say that this might be the card that got me to make a Peasant Cube in the first place, believe it or not. I think it might have been this card specifically. Phyrexia LB1, which is what the set that this card is from, is maybe my favorite set of all time, which makes me seem like an insane person, I know, but I did really enjoy the white-red versus green-red constant gameplay in that format. I thought it was fun. And I
will go on a limb there and join you that while it's not my favorite set by any means, I am a Phyrexian LB1 defender, and that apparently means that if you think it's a below-average set that was pretty fun, then it makes you a giant defender for that set.
There you go, yeah. No, there's obviously many problems with the set, but I liked it. And one of the reasons why one of the things that I enjoyed about this card is that it very much was a data darling, and I'm a data boy myself, and this one was not one that people thought was going to do incredibly well, and it ended up being one of the better commons in the set. And yeah, I think that multiple game objects is huge, and the fact that this is a card that gives you multiple game objects and also then card advantage on top of it by returning your other permanents, and the fact that it makes an artifact for your artifact synergies means that it's a very solid card. It's been pushed out for me just because 4 mana is tough, and the slots are hard to come by, and because I think they're probably better. I mean, not probably. There are better Skyfishers available to us now. I would put this personally at like top of C, bordering on bottom of B. But I do think it's a good card. And
so you've got it about right where I had it. I figured this. I thought the way you were talking, this was going to be a contention point for us. That's roughly right where I had it. Is the very top of C, very bottom of B.
Yeah, I wish I could go higher, but these days I'm just so intent on pushing the mana value of my entire cube down that I need a lot from a 4-drop. And this, but I don't think it's embarrassing to run this even in my environment, and I think many environments this would be totally fine to play.
Yeah, I am going to stick with the top of C here, I think, and just because I think at 4 mana, like, you really, like, there's only a couple of 3-cost Skyfishers that make the top, like, B or above, and I don't really think you can get any of them there at 4 mana.
It's fair enough.
All right, so Tim did want to send his regards that he would have this next card in S tier. I had it a little below that, but I'm open to the discussion point, and that is Fear of Isolation, which is 1 in a blue for a enchantment creature that when you cast it, you return 1 permanent back to your hand, and it has flying with 2/3 stat line. So we've got that very solid core Skyfisher stat line, which even now is really good. This card was an amazing card in Duskmourn. It's in a color that doesn't really get much of this effect, as we've seen, and it doesn't get almost any good versions of this effect. So I had this in A tier, and I would be willing to hear it bumped up to S tier if you really wanted to, but I think A tier for me is where it belongs, where it's a very good stat line. It's a little unique for the color, but it is a cast trigger, which makes it a little harder to synergize with. And being an enchantment is usually downside, though not always.
Yeah, I agree with basically all of that. To me, the main reason why I would have it A tier as opposed to B, because I do think the cast trigger is a real downside. But the main reason to have it in A is just blue doesn't get 2 mana 2/3s with flying. Like the stats are so much more uncommon for blue. To me, more so than the effect, because similar to green, I don't necessarily think blue has the best targets for this. I think you really do want to be picking up, ideally, removal spells like Nowhere to Run, or Case or Saw Blades. And blue doesn't really have any of that, but the body size is just huge for blue. So I think it makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I don't think I'd ever go to B with this card. The stats are just too good, like you mentioned. And next up, we have the card that I think it actually replaced in our Peasant Cube, which is Zephyr Sentinel. So Zephyr Sentinel is 1 in a blue, and it's from the Brothers' War. And it's a 2/1 with flash and flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you return up to 1 other target creature you control to its owner's hand. And if it was a soldier, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. And I was really surprised the first time I saw the +1 counter, because you kind of forget about that in Cube, but then it actually ends up coming up more often than you'd think. I like this card, but I don't think it's super good. So where are we wanting to put on this one? I originally had it in like B tier, but I think that might be too high with creatures, especially because in blue, I think this is actually kind of a cost. This is not a card that's free in blue. I think that the effect is powerful. The rate is decent, but the This kind of got shoved out by, no, it got shoved out by Plume Creed Escort. That's what we replaced it with, which is a much more on-rate for effect for blue.
Yeah, I mean, I think Plume Creed is better. I do think Plume Creed is really, really strong. You know, maybe as a Skyfisher, this isn't as good as other cards, but I think just as a blue card, it's really, really good. And I think blue is able to make use of the fact that this is instant speed way better than white gets to make use of the fact that it's Twingas are instant speed. So I like this card a lot. It's still in my cube. I'm at 540, so I have more room. But I would probably put this bottom of B. I think the fact that this is in my cube and Celebrant isn't tells you, I think, what I think of the card. I think it's a really useful card for especially like blue tempo strategies, to be able to hold up counter spell and then just play your flash flyer. That sometimes gets you value against a removal spell and sometimes doesn't. But compared to these other top, S through B Skyfishers here, this is like, not nearly as good as a Skyfisher because it only hits creatures. But I think just as a card, I think it's quite strong.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I originally had this as like a upper level B card. I think moving it to like lower level B, I think it's probably worse than Chinga, but I mean these two cards I could be interchangeable. I think I would say for me Sticky Tongue is kind of the ceiling of B, and like Celebrant's the floor. And so everything in between doesn't, the ceiling and the floor are the ones I really care about there. Okay, so if you are a Magic boomer, the list is now over. We're done. You can go home. But we do have one more inclusion. And this one's a doozy. So this is Skyline Savior. So it is the dreaded white 1 cost. But in exchange, you get a 3/4 flyer that when it enters, you return a permanent you control to its owner's hand. And if it's a non-angel creature, it perpetually gains +1/+1 flying and becomes an angel. And perpetually means if it dies, it goes to the graveyard, you recur it later, it comes back with that same stat line. And like, I have this at the bottom of S tier. I think it is worse actually than Sun Pearl Kieran and probably worse than Pixie just because 1 white's a real cost. But boy, if you have never turned your Thraben Inspector into like a 2/3 flyer perpetually, that it is a thrill you're going to be chasing for a while. This card is a ridiculous stat line. 3/4 flyer is huge. And making another thing, it's really like a 4/5 flyer worth of stats if you do it on a creature. And we mentioned not wanting to do it on a creature, but like this is the kind of one that you'll just pick up your 2-drop and replay it, or 1-drop and just replay it as a +1/+1 flyer later into the game. I think this card's insane. We don't run it for that reason.
Well, I mean, I'm confused because I thought this was a Magic tier list, and you brought something. I mean, I don't know what the hell this card is, but it's really not a Magic card. But if I have to put it on this tier list, yeah, I mean, the effect is insane. But I'm a stickler about 1 white man. It's a problem for me. I definitely wouldn't put it in S just for that reason alone. And I could even see putting it as far down as B, just because I'm so against. I think that you lose games because of these mana costs, and you don't really realize it as it's happening. And yeah, it obviously will win games too. But I dock a card significantly for double pip mana costs. So personally, even though I've never played with the cards, so my opinion is worthless, I would say, top of B, bottom of A at best.
Okay, cool. Daneelius, that is some great insight. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and stick it up here in S tier because you once you've played it, you can't not put it in S tier. Yes. I will agree with you. An extra white mana will lose you games, but also what will win you games is turning your Neighborhood Guardian into a 3/3 flyer, or
I believe that.
Yeah, cards insane. If you'd pushed hard enough, I might have went to top of A, but I don't think I could. The card stat line is just too ridiculous. It's a real alchemy is a really silly place.
Yeah, if you resolve the card quickly, it's gonna win the game often.
That's the great thing about the card. You draw it on like turn 10, and it's like still the best draw in your deck. Yeah, card's insane. That being said, I will say as a pure Skyfisher, it is actually worse than the other ones. Because if you're picking up a non-creature with this, you don't get to turn it into a giant angel. So really, this is in that vein of like, we said the creature ones are bad, but this is the one exception. So like if you wanted to, put it at the top of A for that reason, I would understand. I am going to leave it in S because it was horrifically broken when we ran it for a brief period of time.
Well, in fairness, no one is actually going to run that card because it's an alchemy card, so it doesn't matter. But
Fair enough. We're spending time arguing over something that all the actual Magic players have turned off the podcast already.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. So that is going to go ahead and wrap us up. Remember, the best way to support Jank Diver Gaming is to come play the Jank Diver Gaming Discord. And remember, you can find this podcast on Libsyn as well as YouTube. And you can find me streaming on twitch.tv/Teld Talks. And you can find Daneelius either on our Discord or over on the Limited Level Ups Discord. And we are all wishing Tim to come back to the podcast quickly and guide us, because we are lost children wearing our father's shoes.
Fish out of water, yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So we're looking forward to having Tim back. And I hope you all at home have yourself a wonderful evening.
See ya.
And so I wanted to start with a bit of a monologue and embrace my inner psychopath for a second. The Skyfisher revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the cubing race. They have greatly increased the life expectancy of those who play in value decks, but they've destabilized control, they've made +1s unfulfilling, have subjected aggro to indignities, have led to widespread psychological suffering, in the paper world to physical suffering as well, and have inflicted severe damage on game objects.